Susan had always thought of Seoul as a city alive with rhythm, a place of neon lights, endless chatter, and streets that pulsed with energy no matter the hour. But that night, as rain-slicked pavements reflected fractured colors from signs and headlights, she took a turn that would change everything. It wasn't planned. Just a shortcut, a narrow alley she believed would shave minutes off her walk home. The laughter from nearby cafes and the sizzling scent of street food faded behind her as silence closed in, heavy and unnatural. Her heels clicked against the damp concrete, each step echoing louder than it should have. That was when she heard it. A voice, sharp, controlled, almost too calm. Another voice, desperate, trembling, begging for mercy. Instinct told her to turn back, to walk away, but something stronger, curiosity or perhaps fate, kept her moving forward. She edged closer, her breath shallow, until the scene unfolded before her eyes. A tall figure stood in the dim glow of a single street lamp, dressed entirely in black, exuding authority and lethal calm. His sharp jawline and piercing dark eyes gave him the aura of a predator assessing prey. At his feet, a man knelt in a puddle of his own blood, pleading for his life. The words cut through the night like glass. "You betrayed me. And you know the price of betrayal." The traitor's whimpers filled the alley, but the verdict had already been written in the cold glint of the man's gaze. Two silent men stepped from the shadows, dragging the condemned upward. And then, with brutal efficiency, the sound of violence silenced his pleas forever. Susan's heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might betray her hiding place. She clutched her bag tighter, willing herself to stay unseen. But in the thick tension of that alley, her luck faltered. His head lifted and his gaze locked onto hers. For a heartbeat the world stopped. His eyes, dark, obsidian, unreadable, burned into her with a force that made her freeze in place. It wasn't just recognition. It was possession, as though the shadows themselves whispered a chilling truth. You belong here now. The city of Seoul looked the same the next morning. Streets bustling with commuters, cafes alive with chatter, neon lights preparing for another restless night. Yet for Susan everything had changed. The world felt sharper, as if every corner concealed eyes, every shadow whispered her name. She told herself it was paranoia, the lingering aftermath of what she had seen in the alley. But deep down she knew better. His gaze had followed her home in her mind, searing into her with an intensity she couldn't shake. Even now, standing in line at her favorite cafe, she couldn't stop glancing at the glass windows, half expecting to see the tall man in black watching from across the street. And when she finally lifted her coffee cup to her lips, her heart stopped, because he was there. Still unmoving, his dark eyes locked on her from the sidewalk outside. He didn't approach, didn't speak, didn't even move. He simply watched, like a shadow that had stepped into daylight just for her. Susan's pulse quickened. She tried to focus on her drink, on the chatter around her, but her body betrayed her, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling. Fear pricked at the edges of her mind, urging her to leave the city, to disappear. Yet an equally strong pull kept her rooted. Curiosity. Fascination. Something unspoken in his gaze that terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. The hours that followed blurred into a waking dream. At the market she caught a glimpse of him lingering by a fruit stall, his presence impossible to ignore. On the subway she swore she saw him through the reflection in the glass doors, always near, never close. By evening her nerves were frayed, her every step shadowed by the invisible tether that seemed to bind them together. When she finally reached her apartment, she stood by the window, staring out into the night. The rain had returned, streaking the city with silver lines. And there, beneath the flickering streetlight, he stood again. Not threatening. Not approaching. Just waiting. Watching. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her hand against the glass, torn between the urge to draw the curtains and the strange, dangerous desire to leave them open. She couldn't understand why he had spared her life in that alley. But even more haunting was the question she couldn't silence. Why did she want him to keep watching? The night air was heavy with dampness, the neon haze of Seoul casting fractured colors across rain-soaked streets. Susan clutched her coat tighter as she left the small cafe she often retreated to, hoping a late cup of coffee would calm her restless nerves. But as soon as she stepped onto the quiet street, the unease returned. At first, it was subtle. A brush of a shoulder too forceful to be accidental, the quick flick of a stranger's eyes lingering on her too long. She told herself it was nothing. But when she turned down a narrow street she saw them. Two men, shadows detached from the walls, their movements deliberate, predatory. Another followed behind her, blocking the way she came. Her heart hammered violently in her chest. She tried to walk faster, but the alley narrowed, trapping her. Panic clawed at her throat. The men's steps echoed against the wet pavement, closing in. One reached out, his hand grazing her arm, and terror exploded through her body. Then it happened. From the darkness, a figure emerged with lethal calm. The tall man in black. The one whose gaze had haunted her since the night in the alley. His presence was instant, overwhelming, like the air itself shifted to acknowledge him. The men sneered, unaware of who they faced. But Susan barely had time to register what followed. He moved with terrifying speed, every strike precise, efficient, merciless. The predators became prey, collapsing under the weight of his blows. Within seconds, the alley was silent except for the groans of the men writhing on the ground. Susan pressed herself against the wall, trembling, caught between relief and fear. He turned toward her, his eyes sharp, unreadable, his chest rising and falling with controlled breath. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, steady, yet carrying a warning that felt like a blade against her skin. I didn't mean," her words stumbled, her fear making them brittle. He stepped closer, not enough to touch her, but close enough that she felt the heat radiating from his body. His gaze held hers, unwavering, dark as the night around them. "You don't belong in my world," he murmured. The words were final, but his eyes betrayed something else. A flicker, brief but undeniable, curiosity, recognition, maybe even desire. And against every instinct, Susan felt it too. That forbidden pull, both terrifying and intoxicating, binding her to the man who could destroy her. The days that followed were no longer her own. Susan woke each morning to the same gnawing sensation, that the city itself was watching her. It wasn't just in her imagination. At first, it was a shadow lingering too long outside her apartment building, a man smoking a cigarette though the glow never touched his lips. Then came the first note slipped under her door, written in sharp, deliberate strokes of Korean. "Stay away or you won't live to regret it." Her hands shook as she held the paper, but instead of fleeing, she burned with defiance. Fear clawed at her chest, but something else kept her rooted. A strange determination she didn't quite understand, a refusal to let the shadows dictate her life. "You're reckless," he said finally, his voice low, heavy with meaning. "Reckless. But there's fire in you." And though his words carried warning, his eyes told her something far more dangerous. He didn't want her to walk away. The city's pulse always quickened after midnight, but for Susan, the darkness no longer carried just the hum of neon lights or the distant laughter of strangers. It carried danger, danger that had learned her name. It began with subtle things, footsteps echoing too closely behind her, men who lingered in doorways with eyes that didn't blink away when she noticed them. She felt it building like a storm waiting to break. And then one night it did. She had taken a side street on her way home, the scent of rain-soaked asphalt heavy in the air when she heard them. Footsteps, deliberate, closing in. She quickened her pace, her breath sharp and ragged, but the empty parking lot ahead offered no escape. 3 men emerged from the shadows, their movements calm, predatory, blocking every path. Her pulse roared in her ears. She stepped back, but the nearest one lunged, his hand reaching for her wrist. "Don't fight," he hissed. "We just need you to come quietly." Susan's panic threatened to choke her, but before she could scream, the air shifted. A presence cut through the darkness, chilling and familiar. He was there, the man in black, stepping out of the shadows with lethal calm. The men sneered, clearly underestimating him. That mistake cost them dearly. He moved like a blade unsheathed, each strike devastating and precise. One fell with a broken arm, another gasped for breath as he crumpled to the pavement. The third barely had time to draw a knife before it was kicked from his hand and he was slammed against a car with crushing force. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The parking lot fell silent, the hum of the city a distant echo. Susan stood frozen, trembling, staring at the chaos at her feet and the man who had unleashed it. He turned to her, his chest rising steadily, his dark gaze pinning her in place. "Do you understand now?" His voice was low, edged with steel. "Being near me isn't protection. It's a death sentence. They will keep coming for you. And when they can't reach me, they'll use you." Her heart pounded, her fear warring with something she couldn't deny. The price of being near him was clear. And yet so was the pull that kept her rooted to the spot. Susan had known the danger was closing in, but nothing prepared her for the moment it finally struck. She had been walking home from the market, the paper bag in her arms warm with fresh bread, when hands gripped her roughly from behind. A cloth pressed against her face. The world tilted, spun, and then collapsed into black. When she awoke, her wrists were bound and the sharp tang of gasoline and rust filled her lungs. The room was dim, lit by a single bulb that swung from the ceiling. The concrete floor was cold beneath her knees, and shadows shifted around her as men with hard eyes and cruel smiles circled like vultures. "You were easy to take," one sneered, his Korean thick and guttural. "He values you. That makes you valuable to us." Susan's stomach twisted. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was bait. Their leverage. The time blurred in that suffocating warehouse, every creak of the walls and every footstep making her heart thunder louder. And then the door exploded open. He entered. The man in black, tall and lethal, moving like vengeance itself. The air seemed to bend around him as he struck, a storm of fists, blades, and brutal precision. One after another the men fell, their weapons clattering uselessly against the ground. Relief swelled in Susan's chest, but it was fleeting. Because from the shadows another figure stepped forward. Someone she recognized. Not an enemy but one of his own. Someone who had stood at his side before. "You." His voice was low, guttural with disbelief. Rage flared in his dark eyes, sharper than any blade. "How could you betray me?" The traitor smirked, a cruel gleam cutting through the dim light. "You've grown weak. All for her. You forgot the rules of our world." The words were knives, slicing deeper than any wound from battle. Susan saw it in his face. The shock, the heartbreak, the fury threatening to consume him. He lunged, and the warehouse became a blur of violence once more, every strike laced with personal vengeance. Blood spattered across the cold floor, loyalty twisted into ruin, and the foundations of his empire cracked under the weight of betrayal. And through it all, Susan's chest burned with terror and something far more dangerous. Realization. She wasn't just caught in his world anymore. She had become the reason it was unraveling. The warehouse still smelled of blood and smoke, echoes of the battle lingering in the silence. Susan's wrists ached where the ropes had bound her, but it wasn't the pain that held her still. It was him. He stood in the center of the wreckage, chest heaving, his hands marked with the stains of violence, his eyes burning with something that went beyond rage. When his gaze fell on her, the fury softened. He crossed the distance in a few strides, his hand reaching out, brushing over her arm with surprising gentleness. "You're mine," he said, his voice low but absolute, the words carrying the weight of both a vow and a sentence. "And I'll protect you, no matter what it takes." Her breath trembled, fear and longing tangling in her chest. She should have resisted, should have pulled away from the danger that clung to him like a second skin. But instead she leaned into it, into him. Because beneath the sharp edges and lethal control, she had seen glimpses of the man he tried to hide, the one who had risked everything to keep her alive. In the nights that followed, their bond grew stronger, fierce, and forbidden. The world outside whispered with threats, but inside the fragile cocoon of stolen moments, Susan felt something almost impossible: safety. When he touched her, the weight of his hands was both possessive and protective, as if he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. His kisses were fire and desperation, born in blood and shadows, each one a reminder that their love was forged in places where love wasn't meant to survive. Yet even in his arms she knew the truth. Safety was an illusion. The betrayals that had cracked his empire were not finished, and enemies watched from every corner. Every time she left his side, the city pressed in with unseen eyes, the threat of violence lingering just beyond reach. And though his vow was fierce, his protection unyielding, Susan felt the unspoken truth between them. Love could not shield them forever. Their fire burned bright, but in a world ruled by shadows, even fire was hunted. The days after the betrayal moved like a blur of smoke and shattered glass. He knew the world he had inherited, the empire of blood and shadows, could no longer be his. Every ally had become a question mark, every corner a threat. And Susan, fragile yet unyielding in her defiance, was now the single thread tying him to something human. So he made the choice. The one no one expected. The one that would sever him from everything he had been groomed to rule. He abandoned it. The power, the empire, the name that commanded fear. all of it left behind for the one woman who had dared to walk into his darkness and stay. The escape wasn't simple. He used every hidden resource, every loyal contact that hadn't yet betrayed him. Passports were arranged under false names, vehicles switched with precision, routes mapped through shadows where no rival could follow. Susan watched him work, her chest tight with both fear and awe. For the first time she saw not just the heir of a mafia dynasty but a man willing to burn his kingdom to ashes just to keep her safe. When the night came, they slipped through Seoul's restless streets in silence. The city glowed around them, alive with neon and rain, but for them, it was already fading into memory. Susan leaned against him in the car, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the layers of his composure. His arm was firm around her shoulders, protective, unyielding. She thought of everything they had endured. The first glance in that alley, the shadows that stalked her, the blood that had been spilled for her, and she realized the truth. Love had not just survived the darkness. It had been forged by it. Stronger, fiercer, more impossible than anything she had ever known. As the city lights dwindled behind them, giving way to the long stretch of open road, Susan closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engine and the warmth of his presence lull her. Whatever storms still waited, whatever enemies still lingered in the shadows no longer mattered. Because for the first time they weren't running from the darkness. They were carrying their own light into it. And together they would survive. If you were in Susan's place, torn between fear and desire, would you risk everything to be with the Mafia heir, knowing his love could both protect and destroy you? Leave your answers in the comments below. I love hearing from you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more intriguing stories like this one.